We have one more module about functional analyses before moving on to interventions based on functional behavior assessment results. Our final assessment topic here is idiosyncratic functional analyses. That is, functional analyses with very specialized conditions based carefully on the environmental variables potentially affecting our client's behavior. Since you have again been assigned a set of empirical articles, we'll go through the major components of each study. First, the experimental question. McComas and colleagues aim to determine whether functional relations between specific establishing operations related to demands and behavior maintained by escape from those demands could be identified and used in effective intervention. A strength of this study is that most of the sessions were conducted in the participants' own classrooms, with students and teachers present and with an instructor who was directly affiliated with the school which they attended. Thus, the setting was quite naturalistic. Some functional analysis sessions were conducted in a more controlled setting, but at least some of the participants' establishing operation analyses were conducted in the classroom. The demands used as establishing operations in this study were those directly from the participants' individualized education plans, or IEPs, again lending social significance to the experiment. Similarly, the toys and activities available during control conditions were those already available in the classroom. It's often relevant to consider the existing repertoire of participants, particularly verbal behavior. In this case, all participants could engage in vocal verbal behavior and follow sequences of directions, but rarely initiated verbal interactions. The authors categorized their dependent variable overall as destructive behavior. This took different forms across participants. The authors in this study also made a point of measuring something more than the behavior they wanted to decrease in occurrence. Did you pick up on what that was? Compliance. Why do you think it was important to measure this? Even if destructive behavior decreased, the participants may or may not have actually begun completing their tasks. It was important to ensure that identifying why tasks were aversive and then decreasing that aversiveness led to them also meeting their IEP goals. Very rarely do we want to simply decrease behavior in isolation. It's also typically necessary and desirable to increase a replacement behavior. In this study, the authors used a four-step process to identify variables maintaining and evoking a response and identifying an intervention. An initial functional analysis, an EO analysis in which they determined why exactly demands were aversive, a treatment analysis to verify that the results of the EO analysis were valid, and a follow-up to assess maintenance and generalization of the treatment's effects. The authors specifically wanted to determine whether the demands were aversive because of their difficulty, a lack of choice between activities, or repetition of activities. A very important take-home point is that with a functional analysis, you don't have to, and in fact shouldn't, simply stop with the result that behavior is escape maintained. What exactly is your client trying to escape? Another good point of review is to consider why demands are functionally establishing operations rather than discriminative stimuli. Demands are EOs because they increase the value of escape. A person can get up and walk away any time, engaging in the same topography as escape, so demands can't be SDs. The demand does not differentially signal the availability of the consequence of walking away or engaging in any other particular topography of behavior. It's just that escape is only valuable in the first place due to the demand being in place. Here's a great table from the article summarizing the methods of the study. Note, though, that the first step is left out. All participants initially went through a traditional functional analysis in order to demonstrate that the behavior was maintained by escape from demands. Then, based on observation during that assessment, specific hypothesized establishing operations were identified. If those establishing operations were indeed evoking behavior, good instructional interventions were developed to match them. The EO analysis condition column shows the two conditions for each participant, the test condition and the control condition. Finally, the behavior column lists the dependent variables, while the consequence column notes what happened contingent upon both of those dependent variables in the EO analysis. First, let's review the results from the initial observations and interviews. In Eli's case, destructive behavior was observed to occur most frequently when he was required to complete novel or difficult tasks. For Charlie, destructive behavior occurred least often when he was given a choice regarding the sequence of activities. Ben's aggression was more likely to occur when he was asked to complete the same task repeatedly. Now, the EO analysis for confirmation of those hypotheses. Note that this type of analysis is also called an A-B functional analysis, since only the antecedents are manipulated while the consequences are held constant. A traditional functional analysis would be an A-B-C functional analysis, since both the antecedents and consequences are manipulated in each condition. We can judge the results of this study simply by analyzing figures 1, 2, and 3. This is often easier than trying to interpret the numbers reported in the text of an article. Figure 1 with Eli's data is shown here. In the top panel, again, we note that the authors have confirmed that the target behavior was maintained by escape from demands. In the second panel, we see that for Eli, almost no problem behavior occurred when the instructional strategy was present, but it did occur when it was absent, that is, when the target behavior was difficult. On the other side of that coin, greater compliance was seen when the instructional strategy was available compared to when it was not. Turn to the other graphs in this article to follow along. In Charlie's case, more problem behavior occurred during the no sequence choice condition compared to the sequence choice condition. Though compliance was relatively high in both conditions, it was higher and with a more stable trend during the sequence choice condition compared to the no sequence choice condition. Ben engaged in almost no problem behavior when the tasks were not repeated, but problem behavior consistently occurred when the tasks were repeated. Compliance was slightly higher when tasks were not repeated. Ultimately, it was absolutely possible to get clear, differentiated results from an A-B functional analysis and identify effective intervention based on those results. Now on to the article by Piazza and colleagues, Functional Analysis of Inappropriate Mealtime Behaviors. This topic is near and dear to my heart, as working with children with failure to thrive due to limited diets and food refusal was my first job in the field of behavior analysis. It's often assumed that food is refused during meal times simply because the food itself is aversive, but that may not always be the case. In this study, the experimental question was whether a functional analysis could identify the variables affecting inappropriate behavior and food refusal during meal times. This study was conducted in a more controlled setting than the previous study, in part because this was simply where the participants were receiving treatment for their mealtime behaviors. It would be important to ensure that positive results of an intervention would generalize to the natural environment, but this is a fine place to start. A variety of foods were presented to the participants without accounting for preference. The intent was to determine what consequences affected inappropriate mealtime behavior, and whether addressing those consequences would increase consumption of a variety of foods. However, the participants' typical food texture was taken into account. All in all, 15 children participated in Study 2, which was the study including the functional analysis. The study's dependent variables are summarized in the far right column here. All behaviors took place specifically during meal times. In addition to these, expulsions, gagging, and vomiting were also recorded, along with acceptance and consumption of food within 5 seconds of it being presented. Note that there were 2 studies as part of this article, and the results of Study 1 explicitly led to the development of Study 2. In Study 1, which included purely direct observation rather than manipulation of variables, the results showed that all of the consequences contingent on the target behaviors differed from parent to parent, and all parents used more than one type of consequence. Thus, it was not possible to determine the effects of any one consequence. A functional analysis was necessary. In Study 2, the experimental design of the functional analysis was notably different than what we typically see used. A reversal design was used instead of a multi-element design. Refer back to your notes regarding the pros and cons of each type of experimental design to consider why that choice might have been made. There was another part of this study's functional analysis that was particularly unique. Instead of only presenting a demand in the escape conditions, the demand, that is, the food presented to the participant, was always included. The behavior only occurred during meal times, so of course this had to be the case. In order to differentiate between the functional analysis conditions, all of the other variables had to be clearly manipulated. Participants only got escape from the food presentation in the escape condition. In the other conditions, the food remained in place, but participants received attention or tangibles. Even in the play condition, the control, the food was presented, but other preferred items, activities, foods, and attention were non-contingently available. Again, in Study 1, naturalistic direct observations were made, whereas a functional analysis was conducted in Study 2. How did the results in each study compare? Results were identical for 3 of the 6 participants who were in Study 1. That is, direct observation did lead to a correct hypothesis about the function of the behavior in half of cases. In Study 2, as expected, it was found that inappropriate mealtime behavior can be affected by a variety of environmental variables, not just escape from the presented food. Additionally, different behaviors exhibited during mealtimes sometimes had different functions. Functional analyses are necessary in order to reliably identify these functions and then intervene appropriately. Happily, in this study, once treatment began, the participants accepted and consumed a large proportion of food presented to them. Now on to the final study assigned this week, one of my favorites simply due to the downright odd results of each step of the functional analyses. Van Camp and colleagues endeavored to determine whether, in these 2 specific cases at least, a highly individualized functional analysis could identify the precise functional relations between the target behavior and environmental variables. This study was conducted in a controlled environment rather than the participants' natural settings, which turned out to be important in order for the precise variables affecting their behavior to be identified. The participants in this study were 2 children who had been referred in order to address specific problem behaviors, to be discussed shortly. Similarly, the materials to this study are so unique that they'll be discussed with regards to the experiment's procedures. This is another study in which there were essentially multiple experiments. We'll skim through the first part because the most important point is that it led to development of more personalized functional analyses. These were the initial functional analyses for each of the 2 participants. In Timon's case, on the top graph, the target behavior hardly occurred at all throughout the first functional analysis, despite the teacher referring him for hand-biting behavior. In Dorian's case, on the bottom graph, hand-flapping behavior occurred at the highest rates during the play condition, what should have been the control condition in which behavior is intended to be abated and not occur at all. So why did these odd results happen? The rest of this paper answers that question. Again, both participants were referred for specific behaviors that occurred during free time, interaction with others, and playing with toys. Timon engaged in hand biting, and Dorian engaged in hand flapping. The frequency of both behaviors were measured. We've already reviewed the first functional analyses for each participant. For Timon, further extended alone conditions were conducted in order to determine whether the behavior was maintained by automatic reinforcement. In one condition, a toy, specifically a bumble ball, was present. In the other, it was not. It was found that the behavior only occurred in the presence of the bumble ball. There was also then a second and third functional analysis for each participant. Let's go through them one by one. First, Timon's second functional analysis. The authors determined previously that the behavior was in some way related to the bumble ball, but they wanted to make sure that it was maintained by automatic reinforcement and not some form of social variable. So they tested whether the hand biting increased if it was followed by access to the bumble ball or escape from the bumble ball. It did not. It simply occurred no matter what when the bumble ball was present. Pretty interesting. In Dorian's case, it was found previously that his hand flapping behavior occurred during play. What could that mean? It could have indicated maintenance by escape from social interaction, adventitious reinforcement from the non-contingent interaction, or like Timon's case, behavior for some reason evoked by idiosyncratic stimuli present in the condition. The second functional analysis was designed to determine whether the behavior was maintained by automatic reinforcement simply whenever someone was interacting with him, or if it actually was maintained by escape from interaction. This graph shows that the behavior stopped when play was removed contingent upon the hand flapping, so it was indeed maintained by automatic and not social reinforcement. On to the third functional analyses, definitely the most specialized ones. For Timon, there were 3 different conditions. In intact, the bumble ball was presented as is. In no vibration, the ball was presented with all of its pieces intact, but with no vibrating. However, the sound of the vibrations did play. In no protrusions, the pointing out pieces of the bumble ball were removed, but it did still vibrate. The top half of this graph shows the rate of the hand biting behavior. Based on these results, what do you think caused the behavior? Try to come up with an answer on your own, and we'll review in a moment. Here are the results of Dorian's third functional analysis. His conditions were 1, both social interactions and toys, 2, toys alone, and 3, social interaction alone. Note that in both of these final functional analyses, no programmed social consequences were manipulated. Only the antecedents were manipulated, making these more A-B functional analyses, as referred to earlier in this presentation. Ask yourself, what would be the implications if rates of behavior were high in 2 conditions, for example, both intact and no vibrations? What variables were common to those 2 conditions? If rates are high in 2 conditions, the behavior is evoked by the variable that is present in both of those conditions. In the case of intact and no vibrations, it would be the protrusions on the bumble ball. In Timon's case, behavior was high in the intact and no protrusions conditions, and not the no vibration condition. This means that the behavior was evoked by the vibrations of the bumble ball, the variable that was common to those 2 conditions. What if it had turned out that the rates were similarly high in all conditions? There was only one variable common to all conditions of Timon's FA, the sounds of the vibrating ball. Dorian's rates of behavior were high in the interaction condition and interaction plus toys condition, but not in the toys alone condition. So it was evoked by social interaction, not the toys. The authors of this study explicitly pointed out why it is so important to include idiosyncratic or atypical events and conditions that may affect behavior, and include those events and conditions in functional analyses. If these variables are not included in a functional analysis, little or no problem behavior may be observed in the first place, or the behavior may be extinguished rapidly over the course of the assessment. On the other hand, although the play condition is typically considered the control condition of the functional analysis, it actually ended up being associated with high levels of problem behavior in this study for Dorian. In this case, behavior was evoked by social interaction, or toys, whether due to reinforcer complementarity, as we'll discuss later in this semester, or escape from those stimuli in the natural environment. Sometimes attention is aversive, not reinforcing, and we would only know the function of these variables through one of these individualized functional analyses. All of the studies assigned for this module included some pretty unique functional analysis conditions, and we'll be practicing creating such conditions in class. For each test condition, consider the following. What do you think might maintain the behavior? What might evoke it? To test for a reinforcing variable, prevent access to that variable in order to create an establishing operation. Then, provide that variable contingent upon the behavior. Create a control condition to compare to the test condition. Either create an extinction condition in which the variable is not contingently available, or create an abolishing operation by providing the variable non-contingently, or both. You can also use an A-B functional analysis. In this case, you would present the establishing operation that you think might be evoking the behavior and ensure that consequences remain the same throughout all conditions. Then, you would create a control condition in which that establishing operation is explicitly not in place. This takes practice, but is ultimately a bit like solving a puzzle. I hope that you'll have fun trying this out in class.